I'm Jonathan Geneva.
And I'm Dana Buckler.
And welcome to another thrilling and dangerous episode of How Is This Movie?
All right. Now be sure to follow us on Twitter at How Is This Movie. Check out our website, www.hitmpodcast.blogspot.com. And most importantly, search for us on iTunes and leave us a 5-star review.
Yes, please. Think about it this way. You're already listening to this while you're enjoying our shiny golden voices. Take 5 seconds to follow us on Twitter, shout out, or leave us a review on iTunes. Okay, so last episode we talked about the MPAA and their rating system. And judging by the feedback we received from all over social media land about the mysterious interworkings of one of the most powerful entities in Hollywood, or should I say, as we learned, one of the most powerful entities in Washington, people seem to seriously enjoy all of the surprising, some might say troubling information that we uncovered. Can you read a few tweets of what people said about the episode?
You know, I want to make mention of one tweet that we received, and that's from the folks at goodpodcast.com. They tweeted that if you're interested in film, How Is This Movie is an excellent podcast. Their latest episode is on the MPAA. That meant the world to us that they wrote that.
It makes me so happy to know that people are actually listening to us. It's not just us sitting here talking to each other.
Absolutely. So to and I'm going to tell you that I checked out Good Podcast, their podcast, simply titled enough, Good Podcast. I found it in the iTunes store, and what these guys do is they actually sift through the tens of thousands of podcasts that are out there, and they sort of serve them up on a platter, the good ones, and say, here, enjoy them. And I just want to give them a quick shout out because that what they're doing is actually really good work, and it's needed in this industry. So goodpodcast.com, definitely check them out.
Yes. So running with this government and Hollywood theme, we decided to talk about something that people may be a bit more familiar with, as there have been several films, both in the form of documentary and in a quote-unquote fictionalized form, that have touched on what we're going to talk about. It's a piece of Hollywood history that I think is even more mind-boggling and scary than what we talked about last episode. I'm speaking, of course, about the infamous Hollywood Blacklist.
What we're talking about is a very, very disturbing time, not just in Hollywood, but in American history. A time when your beliefs were basically put on trial. We live in a country where you are allowed freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. We live in a country where you're allowed to carry a gun. Imagine if you were brought to trial for your beliefs. Now imagine worse if you were brought to trial and accused of something that you didn't believe in.
Guys, it sounds like the plot of a political thriller starring Denzel Washington or something.
I can't wait to see that movie.
Yeah. So let's get started. We're going to rewind to a time well before any of us were even a thought. Before the start of the Cold War, before even World War II. Our scene opens right after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 with the advent of the first Red Scare. What was the first Red Scare, and what does it have to do with 1950s Hollywood?
Well, to answer that question, we first have to look at exactly what the Bolshevik Revolution was, otherwise known as the Communist Revolution. Now, communism, as we all know on paper, is the equal distribution of wealth amongst the people.
And indeed, it does look good on paper. History has proven otherwise.
Exactly. So the Red Scare essentially was, here in America, people were afraid that they were afraid of a communist uprising. They were afraid that their American way of life, the church they want to go to, everything was going to be censored, and we were all going to fall into conformity. And that was essentially the first Red Scare.
With so many of the discontented faces in the working class of the time, and the alleged spread of rebellion, and even worse, communism, many people did. They thought that a communist revolution could happen here. There were race riots, several different major strikes. There was most certainly an air of fear and paranoia that was growing dangerously around this country. This led directly to, the second Red Scare. How was this Red Scare different from the first?
Well, I think the best way to answer that is to look at the time period for the second Red Scare. You're going ahead 20 years. The first Red Scare really lasted for about 3 years. As most historians will say that it was from 1917 to 1920. It was right after the end of World War I, and there was a bit of hysteria afterwards, but things slowly started to calm themselves down. What was really different about the second Red Scare was how news traveled in America at that time. In the 1917, radio was something that was strictly reserved for, for the military and things like that. There wasn't home radios. In in the second Red Scare, you had, national broadcast radio, national print newspapers. The ability for people to get their message out there was much easier. So thus, communist parties in America could get their information out there. They could take ads out in papers. And so this Red Scare became much more significant. Again, this also was coming on the tail end of the end of World War II, where, you had an alliance with Russia, which quickly crumbled and fell apart at the end of World War II.
I think that whole radio point is seriously important, because think of it like today with social media. We've mentioned this a million times. You have this resource that you can spread information at the snap of a finger. That was kind of what radio was.
Absolutely. And
now information has the ability to get out there to those back trailer parks in Kansas, and no disrespect to Kansas, because we have a huge following in Wichita. Yes, shout out to Wichita. But you know what I mean? Back in the 40s, now you have radio being a real consumer interest, and now they have entertainment, information, news coming to them more vastly than they ever have before.
And more importantly, we live in this on-demand society where everybody DVRs everything. When radio news programs came on, the country stopped. The people were home from work, they were off the farms, they were doing everything. People sat around the radios and they listened.
They trusted. It's like Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America. You trusted what they said on the radio.
Absolutely. So if they told you that there was concerns about communism, and let's face it, there was probably a little bit of propaganda that was pumped into these radio broadcasts, some of these radio broadcasts as well. People were afraid of communism. You were brought up to realize that this is America. Capitalism is the way, free market society is the way it is. What they're doing over there in the Soviet Union is, we don't want any part of it. But of course, there was a very small minority in America, sympathize with them. So the Red Scare it's out there. People are aware of it.
Okay, so this is great, fantastic. If you're a historian, what does any of this have to do with Hollywood? We're a movie podcast. What does this have to do with movies?
Well, I'm glad that you asked that, because something really, really important happened July 29th, 1946. William R. Wilkerson, he was the founder and publisher of the Hollywood Reporter. This was the industry standard trade paper for all things Hollywood. It's still around today.
I follow them on Twitter.
He published a trade view column entitled "A Vote for Joe Stalin." That's in reference to Joseph Stalin. Essentially, what he did was he selected 10 very well-regarded screenwriters, some directors, but mostly screenwriters in Hollywood, and he named them as communist sympathizers.
So you have these 10 Hollywood industrialists who became known as the Hollywood 10, who were accused of being communist, having affiliations or being communists.
Yeah, or at the very least, supporting the communist platform.
Sympathizers of the Communist Party.
I'm not going to go over the entire 10 names. I think the most recognizable name on there is Dalton Trumbo. Mm-hmm. He would later go on to write Spartacus. But we'll touch on that in just a little bit.
So what happened to these 10 well-known Hollywood guys?
When a newspaper like the Hollywood Reporter decides to just go ahead and out people like this, something has to be done about it. So enter Congress. Congress says, you know what? We've already got this committee. We already have this committee. What was the name of the committee?
It was abbreviated HUAC, but what that stands for is the House Committee for Un-American Activities.
That was founded in the 1930s, but they had a different agenda back then in the 1930s.
Yeah, back in the 1930s, their whole thing was going after Nazis.
Absolutely, because the Nazi Party was well in power in Germany. They were knocking on the door of invading Poland and thus starting World War II. So the HUAC, as the committee was known, it was their job to find Nazis and Nazi sympathizers. But once World War II was over, well, they're politicians. They still have to be able to do their job.
Yeah. So what happened was they set out to find Nazis, and instead they found Hollywood.
That's exactly it. So they started these hearings, the HUAC hearings, as they were known.
Let's just take 1 second here and look at just the name of this committee. The House Committee for Un-American Activities. Isn't that the most Orwellian thing you ever heard? Like ungood, unbad? Like you said it in the intro. One of America's greatest strengths is this freedom of speech, this freedom of press, this freedom of expression, and you have this committee looking for un-American activity. I mean, what is this? What's going on here?
And let's be clear, this was not a court of law. this was a congressional committee. They couldn't pass sentence on you. What they would do is they would pull you in front of this, you would be brought in front of these committees, and you had to answer questions under oath. And how you answered those questions, depending on how you answered those questions, penalties could be imposed upon you for lying. But that's about as much power as they had as far as imposing long sentences on you. But what they could do was ruin your career.
And it's important to mention, this wasn't like the modern day Tea Party in their West Oklahoma trailer parks gallivanting about whatever issue of the week they picked. This was an issue that had support from big time Hollywood players, Ronald Reagan, Walt Disney, and you have HUAC. This committee was directly supported by the MPAA. As we discussed last episode, one of the biggest organizations, not only in Hollywood, but in Washington, an organization who clearly has the power to destroy people's careers.
Yes. You mentioned Ronald Reagan and Walt Disney as two. Interesting, the first two people that HUAC called in front of them, the first person they called in front of them was Walt Disney, the Walt Disney, and he basically said that communism was evil. He has no part of it. He wants no part of it, but he thinks that there are some people in Hollywood who do sympathize with it, and he just wanted to go on the record and say that he thought it was wrong. The second person to go in front of HUAC was Ronald Reagan, President Ronald Reagan, but not President of the United States.
Not yet.
That was 30 years out. We're talking about President of the Screen Actors Guild. The Screen Actors Guild is the union in which all actors in Hollywood are a part of. It is a union that is there to protect their interests.
Once you've broken into Hollywood, just to put in perspective here, you cannot act in a film unless you're a part of the Screen Actors Guild.
Absolutely. You have to have what's called a SAG card.
Yes.
And it's actually very tricky to get a SAG card. What I'm really trying to emphasize here is that the Screen Actors Guild, for actors, it's their protection. It's they fight for the rights,
just as the teachers union is protection.
Absolutely,
just as
the Fraternal Order of Police.
Yeah.
I mean, the Screen Actors Guild. I'm harping on this so much because Ronald Reagan, president of the Screen Actors Guild, went in front of the House Committee for Un-American Activities and started naming actors in the Screen Actors Guild.
He named names.
He started naming directors, people that were in the industry.
So then the people he named, they had to then go in front of the committee.
They absolutely had to.
So what was it like to go in front of the committee if you've been named like Salem Witch style, pointing fingers? What was it like to be in front of the committee? It was not good.
It was not a good thing. First of all, you were subpoenaed, which means you didn't have a choice. You had to go in front of the committee. If you didn't go in front of the committee, you went to jail. When you went in front of the committee, you were immediately placed under oath. And they started with the very first question they asked you after you stated your name for the record, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, was, are you a member of or do you support the Communist Party?
Okay, here's the most disturbing part of it, I think. When they went in front of the committee, there's no such thing as pleading the Fifth Amendment. Pleading the Fifth in front of HUAC was the same thing as saying no to a breathalyzer test. You were effed no matter what if you said no, thank you.
And it was one of those really compelling things because here you have prominent members of Hollywood going in front of the committee who have moral convictions, who will not stand up, who will not stand there and just tell them, no, I'm not a member. I'm because they felt like it was wrong for them to have even been asked. One of the most interesting things that the people that were brought in front of the committee did, they would always say, before I answer that question, please produce the evidence which has brought me here.
And if you didn't name names, you were blacklisted. Your career was over and people were scared.
And that's just the thing. That's the thing. And we'll touch on that in just 1 second. But the majority of the Hollywood 10, when they went in front of HUAC, they refused to answer the question because they wanted the evidence presented to them. Okay, you think why are you asking me this question? What evidence leads you to ask me this question? I will not answer this question. And of course,
and
HUAC,
what evidence did they give?
They had none.
Nothing.
They never, all they had were other people naming names like Reagan.
Yeah. So you have the Hollywood 10, essentially the catalyst, the spark, which prompted this whole the Hollywood Red Scare here. So this prompted a director by the name of John Barry in 1950, and this just goes to show you how serious this was, to make a film called The Hollywood 10. released in 1950, immediately upon its release, he was blacklisted.
Why was he blacklisted?
Because he was considered a communist sympathizer.
Because the movie that he made was pro-Hollywood 10.
Yeah.
The movie he made essentially was excerpts from testimony in front of HUAC where, again, these people were like, show me evidence. There was no evidence, and so he made a movie to basically demonstrate that these HUAC hearings were ridiculous and a sham and should have never happened. And what happened to him? He was labeled a communist sympathizer, and he was black.
So not only do you have to be directly accused as a communist sympathizer, if you sympathize with those who have been accused as a communist sympathizer, you are now accused.
Okay, so yeah, that's exactly it. So at this point, I think we had better explain what it meant to be blacklisted. We've been throwing that name around a lot. They were blacklisted. He was blacklisted.
But what was the blacklist?
What did the blacklist mean? Well, the blacklist the official first blacklist came out when then president of the MPAA, Eric Johnston, said that
one of our friends,
if you listen to our friend of the podcast, Eric Johnston, if he came out very much pro HUAC and made a statement saying that the Motion Picture Association of America will not associate or will not allow anyone who is both in the Communist Party or a sympathizer of the Communist Party, they won't be able to work in Hollywood.
So now we find ourselves coming up to the situation where if you're one of these Hollywood industrialists at the time, everyone who's giving you a job is against any mention of the word communism.
That's it.
Everyone who's giving you a job, the MPAA, you have the head of the Screen Actors Guild naming, going out against communists, any communist sympathizers. You are stuck.
Okay, let me just say this. It's mind-boggling to think about this. If you had mentioned at one time that you thought, you know what, maybe the idea of communism is maybe not such a bad idea. Equal distribution of wealth amongst the people, blah, 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 blah. By the way, for the record, I'm not endorsing it. I'm just hypothetically speaking. So I'm out in public and I say, maybe communism's not that bad. Bam. I'm now a communist sympathizer. Now let's say that I'm a Hollywood screenwriter, all right? And I have been just accused but trust me, during that time, being accused meant you were guilty. There was no presumption of innocence.
Exactly.
Once you were accused, once your name came up, you were done. So let me just say this. I'm a screenwriter. I'm holding a copy of the greatest movie ever written. This will be remembered hundreds of years from now, but my name is on the list. And I walk into the head of Warner Brothers and I put this on his desk and he reads it and he says, "My God, this is the greatest thing I've ever read in my life. What's your name?" And I give my name. Get out of my office.
Yep. Just like that.
In fact, security
like that.
And security will escort you off the in fact, the police will be waiting for you when you get, it didn't matter what you did. You were finished.
Listen, as a writer myself, there's no such thing as I kind of like writing in my spare time. These writers, these big time, you don't get to be a Hollywood screenwriter you have to have passion. You love it. This is your life. And then all of a sudden, because you've maybe attended a communist get-together in 1932, or you said, "Oh, that guy's my friend who's accused in front of HUAC," your career's over. You can't write anymore. You can't do what you love. So what do these people do? They're on the blacklist, but they want to work.
It's not. Excuse me to interrupt. It's not even that they want to work. They have to work. They've got families. They have to survive. I mean, this is a period. This is bad. When you're blacklisted, pardon my French, you're fucked.
Yes,
I mean
you are. So what do you do if you're blacklisted? You either have to work under a pseudonym or get one of your buddies who's not on the blacklist to it was called fronting, to put the work out for them. Essentially you had to say, "Okay, listen, I have this movie. Put it out for me because I can't."
I'm the screenwriter. All right, remember, I'm the blacklisted screenwriter. You're my friend who's not blacklisted. I'm giving you the greatest script ever written. You're going to put your name on it. It's going to get made, and you'll get all the credit for it. Could you imagine how that must have felt? I
mean, okay, you could say, yeah, well, at least it got made. Okay, good, it got made. But I wrote it. Exactly. I spent 2 years writing this thing, you know what I mean? And now because this fucking committee says, I see, it gets me so frustrated.
It's frustrating because... I want to touch on one other thing, but, it was important to talk about the fact that Reagan named names, but there was also another guy that named names, which people don't talk about Reagan's past as a screener, because the man was the president of the United States for 8 years. So people look at that legacy. They don't really look at the Screen Actors Guild. I guess he made more important decisions when he was president. There was another director by the name of Ilyan Kazan, and he became very well known. He directed movies like On the Waterfront, for
instance. East of Eden, Streetcar Named Desire. I mean, this guy, everyone has seen Ilyan Kazan movie.
This guy, this is a well-known guy. Now, he became probably the most famous person to name names, because in the 1930s he had attended a couple pro-communist rallies. He wasn't a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. He'd attended a couple rallies 16 years prior. Well, in 1952, he gets called in front of HUAC and takes a couple minutes of persuading, and he just starts rattling off names. And he starts and I'm talking
a lot of names.
A lot of names. And this guy, and I'm telling you, how significant is this? How significant was Kazan naming names? This would be like if Martin Scorsese was called in front of whatever our version of
some congressional thing, some whatever.
Imagine Scorsese is pulled in front of a congressional committee, and the congressman says, "Mr. Scorsese, you've made several mafia films. We feel you probably know who's in the mafia. Tell us who's in the mafia right now."
Logically, isn't that the most ridiculous way of thinking about it? But that's how they thought about it.
That's how they thought about it. And could you imagine Scorsese just started rattling off names?
You got Spielberg over here. You got everyone.
So just rattling off names that weren't that Kazan named names that people they weren't.
Yeah,
they weren't. That gets me so upset.
Right. It's not okay. One could make an argument and say, listen, Kazan names names of people who are plotting against America. They want a communist revolution. These people have no affiliation with communism.
Almost none of the people named. Almost none of the people named. Very few, a very, very small percentage of them actually were communist sympathizers. The thing that gets me is there was never any proof. It was a witch hunt of
it was true.
Unparalleled.
It's 1950s Hollywood Salem witch hunt is what it is.
Absolutely was.
So after these trials, people's careers ended.
Okay, so
and yet no evidence for the involvement. It settles down a little bit. Everything it's good now, right? Red Scare's over. No more communism.
Things are starting to calm down a little bit. What's happened is the people have stopped naming names.
People have been named. They're blacklisted.
Their blacklisted careers are over. They're doing what they can to survive. America, people have this whole Hollywood blacklist thing has started to settle down a little bit.
I mean, it's still there. Don't get us wrong. It's there, but it's suffice to say it's settled. The dust settled.
Well, HUAC pretty much I don't want to say they closed the book on it. They just stopped the hearings. Mm-hmm. Nothing more came out of it than just people's careers and lives ruined.
So again, I'll ask it. No more communism? Red Scare over? Question mark?
Far from it, because what happens is as soon as the HUAC hearings are over, then we enter a period known as McCarthyism. And this is, I'm
almost at a loss for words here.
There was some question of whether or not we were going to even touch on this.
But we have to.
We have to. You can't talk about the Hollywood. You can't talk about people's lives being destroyed in Hollywood without talking about the person who took it to a level never seen before, and that would be Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin.
I think this is kind of a side note here. He was a Democrat. He switched to the Republican Party.
That's correct. He was.
Okay, so who was this guy, Joseph McCarthy, before he was a senator?
All right, so McCarthy, before he was a senator, he was born in 1908, Wisconsin. From everything I've read, he had a pretty average childhood growing up. Entered local politics in the beginning. He went
not on the national spotlight by any means.
No. Attended a pretty well-known university. World War II happens. He joins the Marine Corps. Because of his higher education, he is immediately put into OCS, Officer Candidate School, becomes a Marine Corps captain. He goes into the Marine Flying Corps. He's stationed on one of these bombers.
He has some impressive credentials when it comes to this, doesn't he?
He actually received the Distinguished Flying Cross, which you get when you fly more than 32 combat missions in World War II.
Wow, I mean, that 32 combat missions in World War II, some people, I mean, it was really unheard of to fly more than 5.
Listen, the Memphis Belle guys only had to fly 25 and they were done. Okay, this guy did 32 and he did more than 32.
So do you think? I mean, how do you come out of flying 32 combat missions without?
Well, first of all, the 30 he earned the nickname Tail Gunner Joe.
Gunner Joe. That's an adequate title, especially for then and
now.
What he would later do. But let me ask you this really quick: how does someone go through 32 combat missions, dreadful affairs, I'd imagine? I've never been in one myself, and not come out of that with some sort of PTSD, or back then it was called battle fatigue.
Battle fatigue. Yeah,
I think that probably played a part in some of his ideology leading up to the future.
Well, okay, so interesting question. So when he was, I think we're going to touch on that real quickly, because when he was elected to Senate, he became a senator from Wisconsin. He had switched from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party when he became a senator. He was pretty uneventful in his first 3 years as a senator. What I was able to read about him was that he wasn't really well liked by his colleagues, and he was prone to real fits of rage. So you ask the question is, did he suffer any battle fatigue or PTSD? He was certainly prone to fits of rage. He became nationally recognized, not for a good thing, actually. He became nationally recognized because he lobbied for the overturning of the death sentence for several Waffen FS soldiers that were part of a massacre that killed more than 100 POW, American POWs in World War II. Essentially, they caught these SS guys. They were found guilty of torturing and murdering American soldiers, and they were sentenced to death. And McCarthy lobbied for those death sentences to be overturned. And that right there, this is when he was a junior senator. This is his first couple years as a senator, and that did not sit well with his colleagues. That did not sit well with Americans. He had to come up with something to change his image, or else he was going to be a one-term senator and he was going to be done. He was already not very well liked. He had made some obviously big blunders in the beginning of his national political career. So he had to do something. So he was very much looking like a one-term senator, and he needed to do something to really jumpstart his political career, or he was done.
So what did he do?
So he looked at now I give him credit. I give the man some credit. I think he looked at what was probably weighing the most on Americans' minds in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, and that was, again, the Red Scare. It all comes back to the Red Scare. I mean, that you're being taught that as a child.
So what he wanted to do, and what he did do, was essentially he took this Red Scare beyond Hollywood. He wanted everyone exposed. He was quite fervent, so much so that even his congressional colleagues were weary of him. They tried to suppress him, to quiet him a little bit by giving him this kind of meager subcommittee, but he found a loophole and he went on a rampage.
He did, and let me tell you exactly how that started. There's a date, February 9th, 1950. He gave a Lincoln Day speech to the Republican Women's Club of Wheeling, West Virginia. His words in the speech are a matter of some debate, but essentially, he produced a document in this speech that he claimed that had 205 names on it of people that worked for the State Department that were members of the Communist Party. This blew the roof off.
So he's basically saying communists have infiltrated the U.S. government.
Absolutely,
they're coming. You know what I mean?
This guy's got to make a name for himself, and he what he's doing, he's creating one of the biggest political scandals ever in American history. He's saying they've already invaded. They're already here. They're living amongst us. I'm going to be the one who protects us. From now on, listen to me. I'm going to find them all, and we're going to take care of this. And he found loopholes through this subcommittee that he was placed in. Because you're right, his colleagues thought he was a nutbag.
Yeah.
They said that
they were weary of him. You know what I mean? They were like, oh, here goes McCarthy again.
They didn't approve of his methods. They didn't approve of the fact that he would make accusations without any type of proof. He would just say, you know what, that person's a communist.
So he was able to stir the pot so much. So now we've taken it from, okay, Hollywood kind of got it started, and now McCarthy took that and ran with it. So now basically the entire country is in paranoia of these communists.
And they're all looking to McCarthy to expose they're all looking to McCarthy to expose the communists, because he's rose to national prominence now, because he's outing the communists. He's finding the bad guys.
And because of this, people were scared. No one wanted to stand up to him. Because like we said, everyone who's giving you a job is saying, if you say the word communist, you're done.
There's no more Hollywood blacklisting. It's just being blacklisted, period.
Oh, yeah.
And again, I have to say that once you were named, that was it. So off the record, people were starting, especially his colleagues, were starting to say that McCarthy is wielding a little too much power and it's gone to his head. Because if he didn't like you, he would name you a communist, or he would name you something else. And this was what became known as the Lavender Scare.
Yeah, it kind of shows his true colors a little more than just communism, because what the Lavender Scare was basically the blacklist for homosexuals.
Absolutely. Now, we live...
I'm sorry, it's clear that he has other agendas besides just communists, but besides just tackling communism.
Well, now he has become so power hungry that he is now going to go after people that clearly he can't label certain people communists. He cannot go after generals in the army. He can't go after certain people whose careers are so distinguished that to label them a communist, people will be like, all right, Joe, you're a nut. You're crazy. So what he came up with another tactic, and that was labeling them a homosexual, which was, it's a sensitive subject even today. People were killing themselves. People were committing suicide after McCarthy would name them a homosexual. It was, at this point, like we're joking around a little bit. This was an evil man.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a bad guy, and nobody would stand up to him. A lot of people ask the question, why wouldn't anyone? I mean, people had to have known that this was a bad dude. Nobody would stand up to him, because if you stood up to him and you said, Joe, what you're doing is wrong, you got labeled. And when you got labeled, your career and your life was essentially over. I mean, this went on for a few years.
No one would stand up to him. Newspapers, news outlets, no one, except for a man by the name of Edward R. Murrow and his producer, Fred Friendly. If you've ever seen the film Good Night and Good Luck, directed by George Clooney from 2005, you'll be familiar with these individuals.
All right, so who's Edward R. Murrow? All right, well, Murrow is a journalist. He is a true definition of a journalist. Journalistic integrity, cares about the truth, will only report the truth.
And he has a show on CBS.
It's called See It Now, which he started with CBS on CBS Radio. He had a show called Hear It Now, and then once television was introduced, they took the program onto the airwaves, and it was a weekly TV show on CBS News, a news program, kind of like compared to like a 60 Minutes today. You know, they did some investigative journalism, and Murrow was beyond respected by his colleagues. They looked at him as a very, very hard edge, straight-laced, always told the truth, wouldn't report the story unless he could factually prove its authenticity. He had a problem with McCarthy.
And he knew it was dangerous territory.
Absolutely. So him and Friendly, his producer, they decided that enough was enough, and it's time that America saw the real Joseph McCarthy. But before they really got into the expose of McCarthy, they had a warning for the staff at CBS, and particularly the production staff on his show, See It Now. And what was that warning?
He basically went to all these people who've worked with him for years and said, listen, if you have anything in your background that they could find, they will. They're going to come after you, so you better, if you have anything, you better get out now, because they're coming for you. That's exactly it. With fair warning, he told us, everyone in the staff, everything you've ever done in your life is exposed. Now, could you imagine that was this day and age? Back then, it's so hard to imagine at this day and age, because the times are so different. But But if somebody had to go through your background now, you're like, oh, geez, yikes! I don't even barely remember my 20s, right? So what they did was they decided that it was time to present a better look at McCarthy. And what McCarthy was known for doing was, during his hearings where he was exposing people, was taking letters that were written by people, taking statements that were written by people, using them out of context. And one of the great things that Murrow did was he would show McCarthy read something out of context, and then show the actual article, the actual letter, and started to chip away a little bit at the credibility of McCarthy. And not only that, he would leave the floor open open for any of the people he was opposing to say, listen, come on the show and talk about it.
Absolutely.
Listen, we're okay. You say one thing, we're saying another. Let's talk.
So
let's get the record straight.
Murrow's ongoing investigations, it started off with one show. It started to become a weekly thing. Ratings were through the roof. People were glued to this because all of a sudden this Teflon senator that nobody could touch, people were starting to chip away at him. And they're starting to realize that, wait a second, this guy McCarthy is not who he says he is. And at the end of every show, before Murrow would say good night and good luck, he would always say, we've reached out to Senator McCarthy. We've invited him to come on the show. And wouldn't you know it, McCarthy eventually did come on the show and made a complete ass of himself.
Here's a clip where McCarthy responds to Murrow on his show.
Mr. Edward R. Murrow, Educational Director of the Columbia Broadcasting System, devoted his program to an attack on the work of the United States Senate Investigating Committee and on me personally as its chairman. And over the past 4 years, he has made repeated attacks upon me and those fighting communists. And of course, neither Joe McCarthy nor Edward R. Murrow is of any great importance as individuals. We are only important in our relation to the great struggle to preserve our American liberties. Now, ordinarily, I would not take time out from the important work at hand to answer Murrow. However, in this case, I feel justified in doing so because Murrow is the symbol, the leader, and the cleverest of the jackal pack, which is always found at the throat of anyone who dares to expose individual communists and traitors. And I am compelled by the facts to say to you that Mr. Edward R. Murrow, as far back as 20 years ago, was engaged in propaganda for communist causes. For example, the Institute of International Education, of which he was the acting director, was chosen to act as a representative by a Soviet agency to do a job which would normally be done by the Russian secret police. Now, Mr. Murrow, by his own admission, was a member of the IWW, that's the Industrial Workers of the World, a terrorist organization cited as subversive by an Attorney General of the United States. Now, Mr. Murrow said on this program, and I quote, he said, the actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have given considerable comfort to the enemy. That is the language of our statute of treason, rather strong language. If I am giving comfort to our enemies, I ought not to be in the Senate. If, on the other hand, Mr. Murrow is giving comfort to our enemies, he ought not to be brought into the homes of millions of Americans by the Columbia Broadcasting System.
So to listen to that, to listen to McCarthy's response
to call Murrow a terrorist,
it's pretty insane. Now, what had happened was Murrow had already broken down McCarthy's status so much to the point that by the time he responded, like he just did, people didn't buy it. People said, "Here's McCarthy backpedaling. Here's McCarthy. He's up against the ropes now. His
gig is up.
He's done. Murrow never relented on his stance against McCarthy, and he never relented on the fact that McCarthy would make accusations unfounded with zero evidence and destroyed people's lives. Edward R. Murrow is really the hero of this story. He is essentially what ended what is known as McCarthyism, which is,
today means throwing out unfounded accusations,
absolutely.
No evidence.
And so, again, we asked the question, why do we bring McCarthy into this question about the Hollywood Blacklist? He didn't actually start the Hollywood Blacklist. He just brought blacklisting people to a completely new level and destroyed thousands of people's lives. And if it wasn't for Edward R. Murrow, who knows where this country would be right now? And that's why the highest award for journalism you can receive in the United States is the Edward R. Murrow Award of Journalism. Walter Cronkite called him the greatest journalist of any generation. So we applaud him for what he did.
Oh yeah.
And so wrapping up McCarthy, he was eventually censured by the Senate. His career fell apart, and that pretty much ended the era of McCarthyism. Although the title to use the title is still people it's not, if you're accused of McCarthyism, that is not a distinguished title to have.
So finally, we're done, right? No more communism talk for guys like us, aspiring Hollywood industrialists. So we don't have to worry about this anymore, right?
Well, wrong. We'd like to think that we don't live in a world where you can be blacklisted anymore, but I'm sad to report that there was the biggest incident of blacklisting that I can recall happened roughly about 10 years ago to the Dixie Chicks. If you remember, it was right after the start of the Iraq War, and there was tons of protests from the left-wing establishment. Bands like Green Day, they were,
their whole thing was this is a big fuck you. American Idiot, one of their biggest albums was a big fuck you to the government.
Yeah, absolutely. And so they weren't blacklisted.
Right.
No, because people expected.
Exactly. It would have been stranger if they said, "Oh yes, pro Bush."
Absolutely. Yeah. If Billy Joe Armstrong had said, "You know what? I'm quitting Green Day. I'm joining the military because I believe in this war," that would have been, people would have been freaked out if that would happen.
Dixie Chicks, that was the Republicans' part. That was the Republican Party. The ladies of the Republican Party.
Absolutely. They were this would have been as. Let's just say what happened. The lead singer, Natalie Maines, was in England and she was being interviewed on a national talk show, and she had said something to the effect of she was embarrassed to be from the same state as the president.
But of course, the news outlets only played. She gave a whole little speech there.
One could say she was taken quite out of context,
right,
where she was talking about that she was very much against the war, and she wasn't happy with the president's decision to take the country to war, and she made sort of an off the cuff comment about being embarrassed from being from the state of Texas because that's where he's from. But they really
George Bush, we mean
George Bush, yeah. The media, especially the right-wing media, and this was a period of time where you did not, unless you were expected to via a Green Day or a
Howard Stern
and Neil Young or something like that, you didn't talk. I mean, you just kept quiet about it. Well, they were darlings of the Republican Party. Well, they were darlings of red America. The red state, blue state, the heart of America.
Kenny Chesney. If Kenny Chesney said something like this.
So when they made those comments, they became a target.
Oh, the Republican Party made it a point to go after the Dixie Chicks.
They went after them. They organized protests around the country. They got their music banned from radio stations. They got Clear Channel, which was the biggest owner of radio stations in America, to ban their music. They were blacklisted.
I mean, they had protests where people would come and burn the records. It's craziness.
And they apologized.
But nobody
aired the apology.
No, the only thing they ever talked about was that one little, I'm ashamed to be from Texas because George Bush is from Texas. They don't talk about the apology, the rest of the context of what she said.
So, I didn't really, when we were initially talking about doing the show about blacklisting, in the beginning I was like, well, thank God it doesn't go on anymore. And then the Dixie Chicks just sort of popped in my head. I'm like, holy shit, it does still happen from time to time. It happened to Bill Maher. He made some comments weeks after 9/11. Now,
his comments were a little risque.
I'm not saying I agree with his comments, but he lost his job. He was fired, and it took him years to recover from that. Now people would expect him to make comments like that, but back then he was a political moderator on the show Politically Incorrect, and he let his feelings be known, and because it was just weeks after 9/11, he was done. It took him years to recover.
So I suppose the difference here is in today's day and age, if you make a comment like Bill Maher made, you can recover, especially now. And we always bring up social media because social media has changed the landscape in every way, shape, and form. People like Justin Bieber, after doing something stupid, can go and talk to his millions of Twitter followers and say, I'm sorry, or I didn't say this. They can defend themselves. Even back with Dixie Chicks, that was right before.
There was no social media for them. They couldn't get on their Facebook or at the time MySpace or Twitter and say, my comments were taken out of context. I love America. The thing was, they weren't given a voice. Afterwards, they would reach out to news outlets and say, let us tell our side of the stories. And news outlets wouldn't touch them because they were afraid that whatever commercials or products are being sponsored or advertising on their show, that the viewers who are so outraged by what they said would boycott their product. I mean, it's a sick thing that I can't believe went on just 10 years ago. We're talking about how awful McCarthy was. I mean, this shit happened just recently, and it's still, I don't know if, the question I ask is, can it still happen now? We're so connected with each other. We don't have to worry about mainstream media to get our message across anymore.
So the answer to that question, I think, is no. A McCarthyism type blacklist cannot exist today. Unless, like I said before, you're someone like Donald Sterling who brings it upon themselves.
This is what I like to call the self-imposed blacklist.
Right. If you make it on the blacklist today, you probably deserve to be there.
I think that's the best way to do it. You're really,
generally speaking.
Generally speaking.
As soon as we say that there's going to be an exception, but generally, just be a good person and you don't have to worry about getting on the blacklist.
Absolutely. And you do live here in America, we do live in a country where we're free to express our views. We're doing it right now.
Yep.
Gosh, I hope we don't get blacklisted for.
I hope not.
This was an interesting conversation, Jonathan. I can be honest with you. This was good.
It was so interesting. And as a younger individual who lives in this country who, I didn't grow up during McCarthyism, even like the years following that, I wasn't a part of that. So to go back and look and say, shit, like look at what these people were doing. It's mind-boggling.
I want to bring up one little footnote before we wrap it up. We talked about Ilya Kazan, the director. In 1999, he was given an honorary Oscar. And
the man, if you guys remember, we talked about who named quite a few names.
Quite a few names. The one we compared to Martin Scorsese. If Martin Scorsese was to name names today, I want to ask the listeners out there to go on YouTube, type in Ilya Kazan Oscar, watch the reception that he receives when he walks out to accept his award. It's really interesting because
so many years after the fact, you see the reaction of the audience.
40 plus years after the fact, you've got some in the audience who stand and applaud his body of work. You have others in the audience that sit there deliberately with their arms crossed and won't even look in his direction.
Because he quote unquote snitched.
Because he named names, he made accusations, and again, this was without evidence. He became part of the problem. So that's on YouTube. It's worth checking out. That's going to conclude our look at what I guess would say a very infamous part of American history. We want to say Hollywood history, but it was American history. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this show. If you've got some examples of other people you think that have been blacklisted in the past 10 or 20 years, email us, hitmpodcast@gmail.com. We'll read your email on the air if we think you've come up with something pretty good. And for myself, Dana Buckler.
And I'm Jonathan Geneva.
We want to remind you to please follow us on Twitter @HowIsThisMovie. Check out our website, hitmpodcast.blogspot.com. And one of the most important things you can do to help support our show right now is go to the iTunes Music Store, leave How Is This Movie a 5-star review. More 5-star reviews we get, the better placement we get in iTunes, and that's what we're really working towards right now. Jonathan, I think you wanted to add something?
Yes. Again, I just want to say the funniest comment, review, tweet will be read on the show next week. And a little shameless plug here. If you're interested in getting a little more rowdy on Twitter, follow me at Jonathan Geneva. We're going to have some fun on that Twitter, and we're going to mix and match with the How Is This Movie podcast and all sorts of fun things. So I think that's it. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us here on How Is This Movie. We're going to see you next week.
Looking forward to it. Good night, everyone.
Attention, the hosts of the show you have just listened to have been cited as communist sympathizers via the Distinguished Order of the House Committee for Un-American Activities. Any individual who is listening to this will be receiving a subpoena to testify in front of the committee. Thank you for your continued support, and God bless America. Have a great day.